As the opening credits roll, audience see Gary on a train. At some point, he's smoking a cigarette by the open window when his pocket gets picked. He realizes eventually that his wallet is missing and tries to locate the thief. He finds the thief dozing off in one of the cabinets and goes in stealthily to retrieve his belonging. Gary alights the train, and the thief calls after him. He casually hands back the guy's wallet, and the intrigued thief comments how Gary had nothing in his, accusing him of being a bum. Gary tells him to get lost, and the thief smiles at how politely Gary has told him so. Gary gets interviewed for a job. He has a boiler work background, and his qualifications are underwhelming, with no experience in foreign languages, not even English. The interviewer states her company recruits workers for temporary assignments at the nuclear sites. They decontaminate the area, and Gary should be open to a radio protection training in a controlled area. She tells him the pay, but it's not attractive enough. He asks if he can have something better, given his experience in restaurants and building sites. But there's nothing else to offer with his background. Gary decides to sign the contract papers. In a new scene, Gary is impatient about a third party supposed to join him, and the thief, T. Cherno. He urges them to leave without Isaac, but T. Cherno isn't going anywhere because he's sure Isaac will come. And Gary should know better to think that he wouldn't. A van pulls up and Isaac apologizes for being late, citing traffic as an excuse. T. Cherno is pissed, even when Gary waves it off. For T. Cherno, he paid too good a cash for Isaac to be slacking. The trio go to a club and play pool. A man shouts he needs someone to ride the mechanical bull. In return, he'll pay for everyone's games and drinks. Gary takes on the offer. The crowd cheer him on, and he rides the bull effortlessly without falling off. Spectators are thrilled, and two men hoist him on their shoulders to celebrate. After the thrill of the night out, Isaac drives the van to a hostel that he realizes is packed. He tries his luck regardless, pitching in that they're nuclear plant workers, so there should be some sort of reservations for them. The receptionist maintains that the place is full, and they have to leave. They end up sleeping in the van. Gary joins a picnic table close to the nuclear plant. He brings a pack of beer and settles in with everyone else at the table to dine. Afterwards, he's trying to move a heavy bathtub with Tony's help. Jills is seated on a recliner, going on about the dangers of the work. Tony doesn't want Jills to make the job sound so horrible, but Jills insists it is what it is, and they need people to understand that. He lectures Gary about being able to use the correct terms to describe stuff, using a beer mat to illustrate. In the house, Gary is at work with a juicer. He tells Jills he remembers him from his job as a truck driver. Jills worked in the Sunoco factory and isn't an easy figure to forget because he made himself known. Jills commends Gary's good memory, stating it's a useful trait. And Gary goes on to say he's excellent with faces, even though his is a forgettable one. Jills notifies that there are bunk beds in the other room, so Gary checks them out and is satisfied. Gary's training begins alongside his fellow workers. The trainer reveals the nuclear plant is in the Road Valley. A dosimeter gets passed around, explained that it is a device used to record radioactivity. In the case of high radioactivity, the meter will beep. Part of the class are a bunch of much younger boys. Gary seats at Jill's doorstep, Tony finding him there. He's taken his exams, and the results will be in the following day. Tony notifies Jills won't be home till the evening, and Gary states he came by to ask for some money. Seeing that won't be possible, he'll manage. Tony asks how much he'll need, but Gary doesn't give a number, open to some change. Tony invites him into his own side of the trailer home. While he goes in to count out some cash, Gary glances around his space, noticing female products that alludes to Tony having a female companion that lives with him. Tony hands him the cash, and Gary excitedly promises to pay back. Gary goes looking for Mamie at an apartment complex. She doesn't answer the door, even when he calls out that he has good news. He goes to the opposite door, and his sister comes to answer after a brute exchange of words with his brother-in-law. They discuss in the privacy of the bedroom. His sister isn't happy about his new job. He tries to make it sound as glorious as possible, calling it top secret and government classified. She thinks he's unrealistic, pointing out that the job is dumb and his health is at risk. Gary argues he took what was available, and the most danger a worker can likely face is a severe burn. He brings up the perks of traveling, then asks about Nadia. His sister answers she's not fine, and she wouldn't expect him to understand because he's never been in love. Gary goes out for drinks with his colleagues. Jills goes about explaining what someone affected by radiation feels like. He can't piece together the right words and asks for Tony's help. Tony starts to choke to everyone's concern, but it's all a show to get everyone laughing as he depicts radiation as like choking. A woman sachets into their company, She asks Gary to get up, and he obliges. It's her turn to put up a show, kissing Gary and addressing the emotions he must be feeling from having just kissed a stranger. While everyone stares, she depicts those feelings to radiation, and everyone cheers at the joke. A dazed Gary sinks back to his seat, watching the woman plant another kiss on Tony's lips. Jill's toast reveals Tony and the woman are a couple, and Tony has picked right because the woman, Carol, is definitely known for her driven side. Gary gets a pass from his medical examination, and this excites him because it means he's fit to work. On the drive to the station, Cherno teases him for being pumped about getting his logbook. They sign in with their badges at the entrance and put on their helmets. Next up is the locker room, where they pick lockers and change out of their ordinary clothes into working gears, including latex gloves and nose masks. The trainees watch Tony in action near the nuclear fuel rods. Their boss warns them about the danger of Tony accidentally touching a rod. Below them is the reactor's core with the nuclear fuel, a place only a few can go near. Tony's job is to find a loose part in this risky area. Gary is assigned a note and follows orders to deliver. In the process, Gary sees that Carol is also a worker in the plant. She takes the note from him without a form of recognition and goes over to a separate room to bring out a pile of cleaning materials for Gary to carry back. The contaminated materials are stored in barrels. Gary seals a barrel to prevent any leakage or spread of radiation, then drags the heavy barrel to the next guy at the entrance of a different room. At the end of work, they strip off their protective gears and wash off. They're to put their hands through a radiation monitor that would read if they've contaminated themselves. They drop their dosimeters back on the shelf and chatter about what each meter assigned to them read. It seems there's nothing to worry about until the monitor lets out a warning beep for one of the workers. Jill's assures that there's nothing to worry about. At night, Gary fills in his logbook, and at day, he's counting his paycheck with Cherno. Both go to meet some guys and successfully swap the van for a car. Gary takes to driving, and they're all on cloud 9 about how their first paycheck was spent. While still cruising the streets, Gary spots Carol and a friend walking and offers to pick them off. Carol declines the offer, but Gary insists. The girls hop into the convertible, Gary switching seats to the back with Isaac and Carol. Conversation reveals that they purchased the vehicle from gypsies that same morning. The tension between Gary and Carol is obvious, and they act on it at a secluded foliage. As they dress up to head back, Gary questions if intercourse with decontaminator subcontractors is a regular thing. Carol gives a vague reply about how he wouldn't believe the truth, nor will he appreciate a lie. That evening, colleagues are gathered round a table outside the trailer home for drinks. Gary meets them at it and sees Carol wrapped around her boyfriend, Tony. She doesn't spare Gary a glance. He opts to retreat to his sleeping quarters when Tony beacons on him to join them. At the table, there's a couple, the man a guitarist and the woman a singer. They give a passionate performance of a love song that depicts love can be beautiful, but also dangerous. At the end of the song, the couple kiss and everyone else applauds. Gary is the first to leave for his room. At a day at work, a guy named Francis complains to Tony's hearing at the locker room. Tony confronts Francis, who voices that Tony did a rush work to meet his lunch break, and another guy, Denise, is paying the consequences by having to get decontaminated. Tony bullies Francis into shutting up, then spares a smirk at Gary's direction. Jill's, Cherno, Isaac, and Gary have a smoke by the convertible. Jill's asks for the bottle of water Gary has with him. He's riled by the fact that the bottle is empty, as the water was supposed to be rationed by all of them. He goes on about how playing personal and stingy won't fly, as they're supposed to rely on each other. Gary doesn't get why Jill's is getting riled about water, so Gary flings the bottle and smacks Gary on the head because it's more than just water. Gary goes over to Tony's trailer home with part of the money he owes. Carol answers the door because Tony is having a shower. Gary doesn't want to come in and wait, so he and Carol smoke at the doorstep until he decides to just hand over the money to Carol with a message to Tony that he'll pay the rest soon. Carol grumbles that Tony gives her hell over her own expenses so much that it's hard to believe he's lending money to anyone. Gary is at the bar when Carol walks in. They end up in a corner, eagerly making out until Gary regains control and asks them to stop. Gary has an emergency response training exercise with a colleague under Jill's supervision. Gary and the coworker have a disagreement about who should do what, and Jill's beacon on them to rope down. Gary continues to be hostile with the coworker, and Jill's tries to neutralize the situation. During a particular night, Gary looks out his window and finds Carol out having a smoke. He stealthily leaves the trailer home, and they board a waiting canoe into the dead of the night. They reach a clearing, and Carol lays down and lifts her t-shirt, revealing nothing underneath but bare skin. Gary takes her in with his eyes before lowering himself down on her. When Gary isn't working, he's out with his pals, sightseeing or drinking. Then, there are moments he and Carol steal to go to the secluded foliage by the lake to be intimate. While Tony and some other guys are out playing football in the open streets, Carol strides out from the bushes. Tony watches her leave and wears a thoughtful look on his face. He starts side-eyeing Gary whenever they're together, but doesn't confront him. It's another day at work, and a bunch of workers are fumigating. Tony is supposed to go up the roof and Gary is supposed to watch out for him. Tony has an accident with his protective suit while trying to go up the roof. Gary, who is nearby, witnesses the accident. He watches air leave the suit and suck towards Tony's skin, suffocating him. He stalls as if contemplating whether to let Tony suffocate, but eventually rushes to help. His latex gloves prove too slippery and slow, so he takes them off so he can quickly peel the suit off Tony's face. His dosimeter starts beeping in the process, signifying high radioactivity, but Gary doesn't stop until Tony is no longer gasping. They arrive at a tent for proper medical attention. Jills tells Gary he's radiated and shouldn't have taken off his gloves. At the locker room, co-workers acknowledge his bravery. Tony nods in acknowledgement his way as well. Carol and Gary meet at their secret place after the incident. He hugs her, expressing he felt she wouldn't come. They hold each other close, and she lets him know that she's aware of what he did for Tony. Gary quietly shakes his head, and they focus on each other instead. Gary has to see a doctor who informs him he's been irradiated a lot. He'll have to stay in the green area and stop diving. The recommendation is not favorable for Gary as he wishes to remain on the site, but the doctor makes it clear that there's no disputing it. There'll be no more diving. Should he get more irradiated, he'll lose his job. With his short term of service, he won't get much compensation either, so it's best he puts his health first. A better case scenario is that he's moved to a different site, but this isn't good enough for Gary. He wants to stay on the site he is. The doctor tells him he's now on remission. Should his dosimeter read too high, then he'll definitely have to retire. A scene of Carol getting changed for work in the locker room shows up as Gary still talks about the possibility of staying. After a long day at work, Gary is in the shower scrubbing hard at his skin, as if trying to get rid of every form of radiation on him. Gary and Carol continue to have their secret flings. Carol has an appointment with the doctor, and she comes right out with it that she might be pregnant. An ultrasound confirms she's 5 weeks gone, the doctor putting the stethoscope around her belly so she can hear the heartbeat. The doctor notices Carol looks heartbroken, but she maintains that she's fine and happy. The doctor also reveals that according to Tony's file, he's impotent. Carol and Gary stroll through the wildflower meadow, and Gary wants Carol to spill the secret he knows she's keeping. He asks if she's pregnant, and she denies it. He calls her a liar, and she turns back with a chuckle, caught off guard by the statement. They continue their journey, Gary springing by her side like a little boy. They get to Alina's place, and Carol introduces Gary to Alina as her husband. None the wiser, Alina congratulates them both, calling Gary handsome and wishing the couple happiness. Carol and Gary in each other's arms in the foliage when they hear a siren call. Carol explains that if the siren rings 7 times in a row, then it means they have a major problem. The siren continues to ring, and their demeanor falls because they realize they have a dire situation. The singer, Geraldine, is in a controlled area getting decontaminated. The meter still chimes, and safety officers result to shaving her head, which breaks her down into tears. Gary hears Carol choking back on sobs. Geraldine tries to calm her with one arm while holding on to her toddler with the other. Carol wants to leave with her, but the singer doesn't want any more tears. What she wants instead is for Carol to put on her wedding dress. Carol goes to the closet and pulls out the simple white dress, putting it on with a veil. This makes Geraldine happy, which in turn cheers Carol a little bit. Morali shows up in their space, and it has Jills and Tony tensed up. Another man chooses to leave them to the wolves because he knows the confrontation won't be any good. Morali expresses her displeasure for how Jill's team has turned out, but he doesn't feel the blame should be put on him. Tony pitches in that Jills isn't in charge of supervising the security at the building doors, nor were they working at hours the incident happened. Morali accuses him of hiring inexperienced kids, so Jills viciously reminds her it was her idea to recruit the so-called kids in the first place. All he did was follow orders. Morali tells him to send her regards to Geraldine, then she leaves. Gary waits to pick T. Cherno up. T. Cherno has troubles getting the car roof sliding with a knife like they've done in the past because the car had the fault when it was purchased. Gary takes the knife from him to assist. He notices T. Cherno sniffing and asks if T. Cherno is crying. His coworker and friend gets defensive, basically telling him to not stick his nose in his business, like he doesn't stick his nose in the business Carol and Gary have going on. Cherno goes on to state Tony and Jills will be pissed if they learn of the affair and Gary would lose his job. Gary tries to hit back with Cherno's sexuality, but Cherno continues to taunt him, until Gary threatens that Morali could learn that he steals gear parts from the job if word got out about the affair. Cherno tries to tackle Gary, but Gary wedges him first. He promises that Cherno doesn't know what he's capable of, and he decides it's best to back off. There's a picnic close to the lake. Carol wears a sad look, stealing glances at Tony, who looks between her and Gary. Tony gets up and heads towards the opposite end of the lake. Carol follows and asks if he's happy. He states he's happy for her and asks who the father is. Carol chokes out the turn of events wasn't planned. Tony is calm and still walking to the edge of the lake as Carol tries to explain herself. He already knows who the father is, but Carol insists she's choosing Tony. Tony gets agitated, his voice raised slightly as he acknowledges Carol has been with Gary, regardless of how different they might make her feel. Carol pleads with him not to be mad, and he contemplates what they should do about their pending wedding. Carol wants the wedding to still hold, professing nothing has to change. She wants Tony to still have her, and he can't deny he'll never be willing to let go. They pull towards each other in a kiss and embrace. Gary is in the lake, watching them with a crushed look. Gary wakes up on a particular night and decides to cover up his window with tin foil. Work resumes and another accident occurs. Gary mistakenly drops a container of contaminated materials, and it comes in contact with both Gary and Jills, who was squatted close. Jills springs into action, evacuating everyone out of the area and shutting the door. The contents spilled on Gary's foot, so Jills instructs him to take a seat and pull off his overalls. Jills works the meter, and it screeches repeatedly. Jills' whole back was hit, meaning he's more significantly radiated. This makes him cuss out loud and pace about. Jills has a long shower. Afterwards, he's scrubbed by 2 radiation safety officers. Meanwhile, Gary puts his hand through the radiation monitor, and it clears him to his surprise. He goes through the rest of his day dazed, taking a moment in the privacy of a bathroom to scrub himself with vigor. The accident starts to tell on Jills. He's on bed rest and Tony tries to cater for him. Jills shuts him off, not wanting anything to drink because it will only upset his system. He tells Tony he's quit, and Tony wants him to stop overreacting. Tony encourages him that he'll get to see his family the following day, but Jills passive-aggressively states that Tony should know better from the fact that all his stuff are in his car. He has no family to return to. He goes on to muse that his time of procrastinating leaving has finally come to an end, as he's finally been pushed to leave. He advises Tony to leave too while he's still young. The job made Tony impotent, and Jills strongly suggests Tony quits before the job takes more. As for him, he's made up his mind. He'd be gone by the following day. Tony, tired of the conversation, bids his pal goodnight. He walks out to the next room to find Gary still wide awake. He wordlessly spares a long glare before moving on. Gary meets up with Carol at their spot. He talks about eloping with her with plans of where they would be accommodated. Carol breaks it to him that she's not leaving Tony and plans to marry him. Gary doesn't understand how she can make such a decision, but still see him like nothing has changed. She maintains she's picked Tony, so Gary gathers himself to leave, not bothering to look back when she calls out to him. A man and his boys are in the meadow, shooting at birds. One of the boys starts bothering Gary for a cigarette, but Gary is clearly not in the mood. Morali queries Gary in her office for fabricating his decimeter dose in his logbook. The actual result came back to her, and Gary wants to know if it was Tony that snitched on him. Morali lets him know that she'll need to report him, and that means a termination of his contract. It pisses her off knowing the timing for losing another cunning employee is rather inconvenient. Gary claims that he only missed his dose at most once or twice, and Morali retorts she doesn't care if he wants to get radiated. She only wants him to keep it below reportable limits. Gary affirms he doesn't care as well. All he wants is to finish his job, get his money, and leave. Gary goes out seemingly to confront Tony, but it turns out he has the rest of Tony's cash and just wants to pay back. Tony coldly tells him to leave it on the table, keeping silent afterwards until Gary gets the message and gets up to leave. Carol steps out just then, and they both keep to themselves as they walk past each other. Carol and Tony get married, and a good number of merry people are in attendance, including Jills and Geraldine. Gary goes over to their trailer home when the party is over and knocks on the door. Carol answers, and Gary insists that she leaves with him. She resists and Tony steps out to handle Gary himself. Gary stands that Tony won't parent his child, reminding Tony the child isn't his in case he forgot he's impotent. Tony gets riled and beats up Gary in the pouring rain. When Carol has had enough, she tries to pull her husband off Gary. Teacher No finally separates the two and Tony spits that Gary should stay away from his household. Gary packs a bag and takes off in the pouring rain. He has a dizzy spell on his shift and is relieved from his duties to get medical attention. He picks his things and starts to head out when Carol pleads for his attention. He doesn't want to hear anything she has to say, but she runs after him to explain that she was afraid. The siren rings out and Carol edges closer, pulling Gary into a needed hug.